Summer, 1944. The Oklahoma heat pressed down like a great, slow hand, flattening the prairie grass and painting the sky a blistering white. Beyond the barbed wire, dust swirled in lazy spirals, and the scent of frying bacon floated on the wind like an insult or a miracle. No one was sure which. Liselott Brandt stood barefoot outside the barracks, toes curling in the powdery dirt, and felt as though she had stepped into a dream. Or perhaps, she thought, into some elaborate American joke. She had been captured near Le Havre 2 months ago, crammed into a transport ship across the Atlantic, her ears still ringing from Allied artillery. The last time she had eaten anything warm had been a crust of black bread in a rain-soaked ditch. And now there was bacon. The camp was not what she had imagined. The fences were high, yes, and the guard towers watched with their faceless rifles, but there were no snarling dogs, no screams in the night. The barracks were clean, almost too clean, with whitewashed walls that smelled faintly of soap. A field of corn grew just beyond the wire, absurdly cheerful, like a child's painting of a farm. It was all wrong. The war had taught Lise that life was meant to be mud, hunger, and fear. This place, with its neat rows of bunks and its coffee steaming in tin mugs, felt like a trick. A girl's voice broke through the morning quiet. "They are cooking pigs." Hannelore Krause's laughter carried across the yard as she ran up, blonde braids swinging. She was the youngest among them, barely 18, her cheeks still round with the innocence of a farm girl. "Do you smell it?" she said, panting with excitement. "Real bacon, I think. Mein Gott, I have not smelled such a thing since before the war." Lise offered only a small nod. Her stomach ached with hunger, but she did not want to give the Americans the satisfaction of seeing her wide-eyed and grateful. Hannelore was still grinning, too young to sense the strangeness, too quick to take comfort. Lise almost envied her. Almost. A shadow fell over them. Marta Vogel stood nearby, arms crossed, faces hard as the sun-baked ground. At 30, Marta was the oldest of the captured women, her hair pulled back so tightly that not a single strand dared escape. Her eyes were narrow, suspicious. "Do not be fools," she said flatly. "This is propaganda. They fatten us for photographs, to show the world how kind they are. When the cameras are gone, we will see their real faces." Hannelore's smile faltered. "But Marta, why would they?" "Because that is what victors do." Marta's voice was clipped, each word a small blow. "Do not forget who you are." Lise looked away, past the wire, past the rows of barracks. She had stopped knowing who she was the moment she surrendered. She was a nurse, yes, but her hands still smelled of iodine and blood. Somewhere in the shattered fields of Normandy lay her stretcher, her bandages, her captain's last words. That life was gone. Here she was only a prisoner with an empty stomach and the taste of salt still on her lips from the crossing. The breakfast bell rang, a deep clang that sent ripples of motion through the yard. The women lined up, boots crunching on gravel. A few American guards lounged nearby, rifles slung casual across their shoulders. One of them, an officer with a square jaw and sunburned skin, watched the line with a look that was neither hostile nor amused, but faintly curious, as though they were some peculiar species of bird. Lise caught his eye for a moment before looking away. His name, she had learned, was Captain Frank Delaney. Inside the mess hall, the smell was almost unbearable. Grease popped and hissed on iron griddles, and the steam clung to the ceiling in glistening sheets. The women filed past the serving line, each handed a tray, scrambled eggs, bread, coffee, and yes, 2 strips of bacon, glistening like treasure. Lise stared down at hers, almost afraid to touch it. Her stomach snarled, humiliating her. "Eat," Marta ordered, sitting opposite her. "Better to keep up strength." Hannelore did not wait to be told. She took a bite, closed her eyes, and let out a sigh that was almost a prayer. "Oh," she said softly, "I think I will cry." Lise bit into hers, and for a moment, her body forgot the war. The salt, the smoke, the rich fat melting on her tongue. It was a taste so distant from turnip soup and ersatz coffee that it felt obscene. She swallowed and stared at her tray. Was this mercy or temptation? She could not tell. After breakfast, they were led out for morning roll call. The sun was higher now, glaring. Captain Delaney passed down the rows, nodding slightly to each group. When he reached Lisa's row, he paused. "You all right, miss?" he asked in careful, accented German. His voice was deep, unhurried. Lise did not answer at once. It felt strange to be addressed with politeness by a man in uniform, an enemy uniform. Finally, she said, "Yes." Her German sounded too formal even to her own ears. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Good," he said, and moved on. Hannelore elbowed her after he was gone, giggling. "He is handsome," she whispered. Lise said nothing. That night, lying on the narrow bunk, Lise listened to the sounds of the camp, the distant murmur of guards' voices, the creak of the windmill outside the wire. She thought of the bacon, of its warmth in her hands. She thought of Delaney's steady gaze. Something had shifted inside her today, though she could not name it. The camp was still a cage, the war was still raging, but a seed of something had been planted. Doubt, perhaps, or hope. She turned over, staring at the shadowed rafters. She was not sure which was more dangerous. The next morning, the bell rang again, and the smell of bacon was stronger, carried on a breeze that made the whole camp stir. Hannelore sat up, hair a mess, and grinned. "They feed us like kings," she said. "Perhaps tomorrow they will bring champagne." Marta's voice was sharp in the dim barracks. "Laugh while you can. This is not kindness. This is their way of breaking us." Lise pulled on her boots, heart heavy. She wanted to believe Marta was wrong. She wanted to believe the food was just food, the guards just men, and that the world could still hold something good amid the ruin. But she could not quite bring herself to trust it. As they filed out into the blazing sun, she caught sight of Delaney again, leaning against a post, arms folded. For an instant, their eyes met, and something like a challenge passed between them, silent, electric. Then the bell clanged again, and the women marched on. But later, as Lise sat with her tray, the first bite of bacon burning her tongue, a voice shouted from the gate. A messenger had come, breathless, shouting news in English the women could not yet understand. The guards' faces changed, their laughter cut short. A ripple passed through the room like a wind before a storm. Someone translated, haltingly, the words that would change everything. The Allies had landed in France. D-Day had begun. The bacon turned to ash in Lisa's mouth. The heat rose earlier each morning now, shimmering above the wire like a mirage. The dust was fine enough to taste, mixing with the salt of sweat on Lisa's lips. The days had settled into a rhythm, roll call, work details, meals, but nothing felt ordinary. Every clang of the mess hall bell still startled her. Every waft of frying bacon still made her heart leap and her stomach ache. D-Day had been 3 weeks ago, and word traveled even here. The guards spoke in lower voices. Trucks came and went more often. The women whispered at night about what the landings meant, whether their brothers still fought, whether their cities still stood. Breakfast was its own kind of theater now. The smell alone could have lured a starving fox from its den. In the cavernous mess hall, griddles sizzled like distant gunfire, spitting grease that popped against the metal walls. American cooks moved with casual precision, their white aprons streaked with brown, flipping strips of pork that curled like red banners. The women filed through in silence, trays held steady, their faces a mixture of hunger and wariness. The sound of bacon frying had become the strange soundtrack of their captivity, a reminder that this was no German camp. No commandant barked orders here. Instead, there was the clatter of utensils, the hiss of coffee urns, and the faint sound of Glenn Miller from a guard's radio. Hannelore had begun to hum along with the music, earning frowns from Marta and a few of the other women. "It's just a song," she said once, sheepish, when Marta snapped at her. "Songs cannot betray anyone." "Songs make you forget," Marta shot back. "They make you soft." But even Marta could not resist the food forever. Lise watched her one morning as she held a strip of bacon between 2 fingers, staring at it as though it might reveal its secrets. Then, with a quick, almost guilty motion, she ate it. Something in her shoulders relaxed, just a little. Perhaps survival, Lise thought, was teaching them all to make small betrayals. The work assignments varied. Some women were sent to shell pecans in the shade of the big barn, others to weed vegetable patches outside the wire under armed guard. Lise was sometimes put to work in the infirmary, cleaning and sorting supplies. She liked the quiet there, the smell of alcohol and bandages, which felt closer to her old life. Once, Captain Delaney came in, sleeves rolled up, talking with the camp doctor. He caught sight of her scrubbing a table and gave her the smallest nod. It was not much, but it was something to hold on to, something human. The culture clash was most stark on Sundays, when local church groups arrived with Bibles and sweet rolls. The women accepted the rolls but avoided the books, leaving them stacked untouched. Hannelore, curious, asked Delaney once what the Americans prayed for. He hesitated, then said, "Mostly peace, and for our boys to come home." She nodded as if this were reasonable, but that night she told Lise, "I think they pray for our defeat. But perhaps that is peace to them." The guards were not cruel, but they were not blind. They knew the war news mattered. Once, during morning roll call, a sergeant read aloud that Paris had been liberated. A cheer went up from the guards. The women stood stiffly, some with their jaws clenched, some with tears in their eyes. Marta spat in the dust. "Paris will be retaken," she muttered, though no one answered her. They all knew the tide was turning. The barbed wire that had once felt like a wall now felt like a shield, keeping out a world that was collapsing. One afternoon, a farm pig from a neighboring field broke through the fence and charged straight into the camp, squealing with delight. Chaos erupted. Women screamed and scattered, guards shouted and laughed, and the animal made a beeline for the mess hall before being caught. Even Marta smiled, shaking her head as she watched the absurd chase. For a brief moment, the camp was filled with laughter, the kind that came from the belly, unguarded and free. It felt dangerous, that laughter, like something forbidden. But when it was over, a new warmth lingered, as if the camp itself had drawn a deep breath. Lise began to notice the small ways in which captivity was changing her. She no longer jumped at the sound of the bell. She no longer ate her meals in rigid silence. Sometimes, she caught herself almost smiling when the guard's radio played a jaunty tune. And yet guilt followed her like a shadow. Each bite of bacon felt both like a gift and a theft. Her brother's last letter, carried in her pocket until it was nearly rubbed blank, spoke of hunger, of neighbors boiling weeds to make soup. How could she eat while he starved? That night she dreamed of Dresden, of smoke rising from blackened streets. When she woke, heart pounding, she lay staring at the baroque ceiling, listening to the rhythmic breathing of the others. Somewhere beyond the wire, a coyote howled. The sound was so lonely it made her chest ache. Captain Delaney remained a quiet presence. He walked the perimeter each morning, spoke to the guards in low tones, kept order without shouting. Once, Lise saw him kneel to fix a boy's broken bootstrap, an American guard barely out of his teens. The sight unsettled her. She wanted him to be cruel, or at least indifferent. It was easier to hate an enemy who stayed behind his mask. Instead, he kept offering these small gestures that complicated everything. The summer wore on. The corn ripened and turned golden, and the air grew thick with the smell of earth and livestock. Letters from home trickled in, some bearing black borders. Hannelore received word that her father had been killed in an air raid. She did not cry until that night, when the lights were out. Then she wept into her blanket until Lise climbed onto her bunk and held her like a child. Marta said nothing, but the next morning she gave the girl her portion of jam without comment. The camp was full of such quiet acts, small attempts to stitch dignity back into lives that had been ripped open. One morning, as the women lined up for breakfast, Delaney stood near the mess hall door, arms folded. His face was unreadable, but there was a tension about him, as though he was bracing for something. When Lise passed, he said something softly in English that she did not catch, but his tone made her glance up. There was no mockery in his eyes, only a kind of gravity, as though he knew something they did not. Inside, the smell of bacon was overwhelming, the griddles smoking under the weight of so many strips. The cooks were unusually silent. The women took their trays, sat, ate. Conversation was subdued. Even Hannelore, usually the first to chatter, kept her head down. Lise chewed slowly, aware of every sound. The scrape of forks, the hiss of fat, the faint crackle of the radio on the shelf. Then, without warning, the radio's music stopped. A voice came on, urgent, speaking fast English. The guards froze. Delaney stepped inside, took off his cap, and listened, his jaw tightening. The women watched in silence, unease prickling down their spines. When the announcement ended, Delaney put his cap back on and gave a single curt order to the sergeant. The guards began moving, shutting windows, calling for roll call. Marta hissed under her breath, "Something has happened." Outside, the heat was already rising, turning the ground to white fire. The women stood in their rows, shading their eyes. Delaney faced them, his expression grave. "Warsaw has risen against the Germans," someone translated in a whisper. "And the Russians are advancing." A murmur rippled through the women, part fear, part disbelief. Marta's lips thinned. Hannelore clutched Lisa's sleeve. The war was moving faster than any of them could follow. Even here, halfway across the world, they could feel its breath at their backs. When they were dismissed, Lise walked slowly back toward the barracks, her tray still in her hands. The taste of bacon lingered on her tongue, too heavy, too sharp. It no longer felt like a gift. It felt like a reminder that the world outside was burning and the fire was coming closer. The wind had turned cooler by late August, bringing with it the smell of harvested fields beyond the camp. The corn had been cut, leaving stalks like jagged bones against the horizon. Even the air seemed sharper, as if the prairie itself sensed that something was shifting. The women felt it too. The news grew more grim with each passing week. Romania had switched sides, the Russians were pushing deeper into the Reich, and Allied bombers struck cities without pause. At night, when the lights were out and the guards' footsteps faded, Lise could hear muffled sobs from different bunks, each one belonging to someone who had received a letter bearing black edges. The mornings no longer carried the same eager anticipation. The bacon still sizzled, but it no longer brought simple hunger. Each strip now felt like a barbed choice: accept and be comforted, or reject and remain defiant. Marta stopped eating it entirely, leaving hers on the tray as if to prove something, though no one said what. Hannelore, on the other hand, took hers gladly, though she had stopped humming American tunes. Her laughter had dulled, replaced by a wary watchfulness that made her seem suddenly older. Lise found herself caught between them, between Marta's rigid refusal and Hannelore's hesitant surrender. She could not stop wondering whether comfort was a trap. The Americans had not hurt them, had not starved them, had even given them soap and bandages and books. But each kindness chipped at the wall she had built around her loyalty, leaving cracks that let in the light, and with the light came questions. One afternoon, while working in the infirmary, Lise discovered a stack of American newspapers left on a table. They were weeks old, but the headlines were still bold. Photos reveal Nazi atrocities. There were images printed in stark black and white, piles of skeletal bodies, hollow-eyed children staring at the camera. She stood frozen, the paper trembling in her hands. These could not be real. Or if they were real, then the world she had believed in had been built on lies. She pressed the papers to her chest and felt her knees weaken. The camp doctor found her like that, pale and silent, and said nothing. He simply took the papers from her gently, as if they were a dangerous medicine. That night, she tried to tell Marta what she had seen. Marta's face hardened into stone. "Lies," she spat. "American lies to make us ashamed. They had photographs. Photographs can be faked. You think they will not do that to break us?" Marta's voice rose, raw with anger. "Do you not see what is happening? First they feed us, then they play their music, then they show us these pictures. Soon you will be thanking them for winning." Lise turned away, unable to argue but unable to agree. Her hands still felt the weight of the newspaper, as though the ink had seeped into her skin. She lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint scratch of a guard's boots outside. For the first time, she wondered what she would say to her brother if he walked into the barracks at that moment. Would she tell him to keep fighting? Or to lay down his rifle and surrender? The days stretched longer. The camp took on a strange quiet, not tense but heavy, as though everyone was waiting for something. Rumors of escape began to circulate, half-whispered plans that vanished as soon as they were spoken aloud. Some women spoke of trying to reach Mexico, others of finding work in America once the war ended, though no one knew if such a thing would be allowed. The fence no longer felt like the only thing holding them in. It felt like something they were holding on to. Captain Delaney remained a steady figure, walking the yard each morning, speaking to the guards in that calm, unhurried tone. Lise had grown accustomed to seeing him, to the way he tipped his cap slightly when passing their group. One evening, near sunset, she lingered by the fence after work, sketching the horizon in a notebook she had fashioned from scraps. The prairie was all gold and shadow, the sky streaked with purple. Delaney approached quietly, not startling her. "You draw," he said in slow, careful German. "Yes." She did not look up. He studied the page a moment, then nodded. "Good." His voice was low, thoughtful. After a pause, he handed her something through the wire, a small, worn book of poetry. The cover was green, the pages soft with age. She blinked at him. "Whitman," he said simply, then walked away. That night, Lise read by the light of the single bulb in the barracks, careful not to wake the others. The words were strange and beautiful, full of grass and rivers and freedom. They made her chest ache in a way that was both painful and sweet. She thought of Delaney's quiet face, of the fact that he had given her something not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The world was not as simple as Marta claimed. Nothing was. Even Marta seemed to soften slightly as the weeks passed. She no longer glared at Hannelore for smiling, and once Lise saw her tuck a piece of bread into the pocket of a woman too sick to leave her bunk. Yet her anger remained like a coiled spring, ready to strike. When a guard's radio blared news of another German city bombed, Marta muttered curses under her breath until her voice cracked. The war reached into the camp in other ways. New prisoners arrived, men this time wounded and weary, their faces gray with defeat. They spoke of retreat, of bridges blown, of villages burned. Hannelore listened wide-eyed, and afterward she sat very still, hands clasped in her lap. "Do you think," she asked softly one night, "that there will be anything left to go home to?" Lise could not answer. She thought of Dresden again, of the letter in her pocket, and said only, "We will see." Autumn came, painting the prairie in rust and gold. The mornings were crisp, the bacon scent sharper in the chill air. Lise had stopped flinching at its smell. She still ate it, but slowly, as though each bite required a decision. Some part of her had changed. She felt it in her bones, in the way she looked at the guards, at the sky, at her own hands. Captivity had not broken her, but it had made her into someone she did not fully recognize. One evening, a storm rolled across the plains, black and sudden, the wind howling through the camp like a living thing. The women huddled in the barracks, lightning flashing through the cracks in the shutters. Thunder rattled the tin roof, and for a moment it sounded like shellfire again. Hannelore whimpered. Marta sat rigid, knuckles white on her knees. Lise closed her eyes and let the storm shake through her, feeling both terrified and strangely alive. When it passed, the air smelled clean, electric. The ground steamed under the moonlight. Something in her heart felt scrubbed raw. The next morning, as the sun rose pink over the wet earth, a messenger arrived on a dusty motorcycle. He spoke urgently to Delaney, who nodded once, then gathered the guards. The women were lined up again, the dew soaking their shoes. Delaney's face was graver than she had ever seen it. "The war in France is nearly over," someone translated. "The Allies are crossing into Germany." A low murmur spread through the ranks. Marta's face went pale. Hannelore gripped Lisa's arm. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tilt. Whatever was coming, it would not be slow. The war was racing toward its end, and with it, their time in this place. Lise stood very still, the morning light catching on her hair, the taste of last night's bacon still on her tongue. She did not know whether to pray for the wire to hold them a little longer, or for it to finally open. Frost came early that year. The prairie grass stood stiff and white at dawn, glittering like a field of bayonets. Breath showed on the morning air, rising in pale clouds above the rows of women standing for roll call. By now the war was a different creature altogether, its roar no longer distant. The women knew it from the letters that did not come, from the new prisoners with hollow eyes, from the weary way even the guards carried themselves. Germany was cracking open. The world was tilting toward something no one could quite name. Lise had grown thinner but stronger. The girl who had stood barefoot in the dust that first day seemed far away now, like a ghost she might have dreamed. She had learned the language of the camp, the timing of bells, the guards' habits, the smell of rain before it came. She had learned the weight of her own thoughts, too, which felt heavier each night. She could no longer pray for victory. She could not bring herself to pray for defeat. Instead, she prayed for the world to end quietly, as gently as the first snow that had fallen overnight, covering the camp in a soft, deceptive peace. The news finally came on a gray morning when even the wind was still. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. There was no cheer, no shouting, only a stunned silence that seemed to stretch across the camp like a shroud. Hannelore covered her face with both hands and wept openly. Marta sank to the ground, rocking slightly, whispering something too low for anyone to hear. Lise stood very still, feeling as if she had been hollowed out. The end she had prayed for had come, and yet it felt nothing like an ending. It felt like stepping into a room where the furniture had been moved, leaving everything strange and unfamiliar. The days that followed were heavy with waiting. The Americans told them they would be repatriated soon, sent back across the ocean to a homeland that was no longer whole. Some women rejoiced, already speaking of mothers they had not seen in years, of children they hoped were still alive. Others, like Marta, were filled with dread. "I will not go," she said one night, her voice sharp as broken glass. "They will call us traitors for surrendering. They will send me to the Soviets." She gripped Lisa's wrist hard enough to bruise. "Better to stay here behind this wire than go back to face that." Hannelore tried to soothe her, but Marta shoved her away. "You are too young to understand. You think the world will forgive us because we were fed bacon and coffee. They will not forgive. They will never forgive." Her voice broke then, and she turned away, shoulders shaking. Lise lay awake long after the others had fallen silent, staring at the rafters. She did not know if Marta was wrong. When the first snow melted, preparations for transport began. The women were issued warmer coats, their names recorded carefully on lists. The camp seemed to hold its breath. Lise worked one last shift in the infirmary, packing supplies into crates. When she stepped outside, the sky was burning with the red of a winter sunset, and Captain Delaney was there, leaning against the fence post. "You go soon," he said in halting German. "Yes." She kept her hands folded tightly, as though to keep them from shaking. He hesitated, then said, "It will be hard, but maybe good." The wind caught at her scarf, tugging it loose. "I do not know what waits for us there," she admitted. "I am not sure who I will be when I go back." Delaney's eyes softened. "Maybe that is the point. You get to choose." Something in her throat ached. She wanted to tell him about the poems he had given her, about the way they had kept her warm on nights when the cold had cut through the barracks like a knife. She wanted to thank him for looking at her as if she were not a prisoner but simply a person. Instead, she said only, "Goodbye," because there were not words enough for what she felt. On the morning of their departure, the camp woke early. The mess hall smelled as it had that first day, of bacon sizzling, of coffee boiling, of bread toasting on great racks. The women moved through the line slowly, as if each step carried weight. Hannelore smiled faintly at the cooks, shy and grateful. Marta's face was blank, but her hands trembled as she took her tray. Lise sat with them at their old table, her breath rising in the cold air. She ate slowly, tasting each bite as though committing it to memory. The bacon was crisp, the salt stinging her tongue, the fat sweet as butter. Around her, the clatter of forks and the low murmur of voices seemed muted, as if wrapped in cotton. She thought of the first morning, when she had been certain this food was a trick. She thought of all the mornings since, of the days spent waiting for something she could not name. When the final bell rang, they gathered their few belongings and walked to the gate. Beyond it waited the trucks that would take them to the train that would carry them toward a country of ruins. Snow had begun to fall again, light as ash, dusting their coats and hair. Marta paused just before the gate, looking back once, her jaw tight. Then she stepped through. As Lise passed the threshold, she felt the air change, as though the wire itself had been holding its breath and now released it. She glanced once over her shoulder and saw Delaney standing by the fence, cap in his hand. Their eyes met across the distance, and she felt something twist inside her. Grief, gratitude, something nameless that burned like a coal. She lifted her chin in the smallest nod, and he returned it. Then she turned away. The trucks rumbled to life, gears grinding. As they climbed aboard, the smell of bacon still clung to them, faint but persistent, a ghost of the life they were leaving behind. Lise sat between Marta and Hannelore, her hands gripping the wooden slats. The engine roared, and the camp began to recede. She watched the barbed wire shrink into the distance, the guard towers growing smaller against the pale sky. For a long moment she thought she might cry, but no tears came. Instead, she breathed deeply, taking in the sharp smell of snow, of smoke from the truck's exhaust, of iron and grease. The taste of bacon still lingered, heavy with memory. As the prairie unrolled before them, white and endless, she felt the faintest stirring of something new. Not joy exactly, not yet, but the possibility of it. For the first time in years, she imagined a future not dictated by orders or propaganda or hunger. A future she might shape herself. The truck hit a rut, jolting hard, and the women clutched one another to keep from falling. Hannelore laughed breathlessly, and even Marta allowed the corner of her mouth to twitch. The sound startled Lise, and then, unexpectedly, she laughed too, the sound breaking free like thawed water. It startled her with its brightness, with its wildness. Somewhere far off, a train whistle blew, long and low, like a call. The trucks turned toward the sound, wheels hissing on the wet road. Snow swirled in their wake, erasing their tracks almost as soon as they were made. Lise closed her eyes for a moment and let the wind sting her face. She thought of the first morning, of the bacon that had tasted like a curse. Now it felt like a blessing, a strange symbol of the life she had survived. For the rest of her years, she would remember this smell, this moment, the road stretching ahead, the taste of salt on her lips, the wire behind her fading into the white horizon. The war was over. What lay ahead would not be easy, but it would be hers.